有缘. Today we're going to explore the Buddhist concept and practice of renunciation. This is a concept that could be unattractive to people or difficult practice, especially for today's society, and a society that in most cases places more importance on external values of a person than on a person's personal wealth. The word renunciation in English, it connotes negatively a desperate way of letting go, to give away or relinquish, to reject, or to disown. But Buddhist renunciation is not completely about these. It is the same with the translation of Shila, discipline, the second of the six paramita, the six perfections. People can associate the word with severe punishment, something quite negative. So such concepts seem to represent something opposite of what people aspire for, which is freedom, life without restrictions, abundance, something better, something positive. But we cannot just blame the English translation for the negative connotations of concepts such as renunciation and discipline in this language, because it is always up to us to explore, to actively engage in contemplating on these ideas and understand why the practices of them actually help improve our well-being and help us progress on our spiritual path. And then we can see that Buddhism, instead of being pessimistic or nihilistic, is a highly optimistic path, for it teaches that we can perfect ourselves here and now and liberate ourselves by our own efforts from all suffering and unhappiness, and be inspired by what renunciation is and how it serves us to experience unchanging joy, happiness, and lightness of being. As we know, the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama was born a prince and chose to leave everything behind to go on his path of spiritual cultivation. But Buddhist renunciation isn't about extreme simplicity or giving up pleasures and the finer things of life. It is about being able to appreciate and experience life fully, yet not attached to or emotionally depend on what we experience. In doing so, it leads to the way to live without fear, limitation, or delusions. Renunciation takes the form of wise surrender to what is inevitable. It is a way of life that focuses on our inner change that may or may not require external renunciation. According to the Buddha, the physical world, the worldly world, as we know, it has two fundamental characteristics. It contains nothing permanent. It contains nothing worth being considered as a self-identity, as me or mine. And it's for these fundamentals of the reality of the worldly world, reincarnating beings may be saddened, finding these unsatisfactory and realizing their suffering within the worldly world. And this becomes the theme of the noble truth around suffering, which have these two characteristics of the worldly world as the precondition. The Buddha knew personally the pleasure and happiness found in the worldly world. He has experienced it the same way any unenlightened being would have experienced in an ordinary way. He understood the impermanence of such pleasure and happiness, how transient, limited, and relative they are. So he chose to seek instead what is transcendental, absolute, unchanging, and boundless. That is essentially nirvana, the absolute state, the goal of all Buddhists on a spiritual path. So renunciation is not about leaving society and moving to a mountain hermitage either. It is a state of one's mind based on the understanding of the truth of impermanence and suffering within the samsara, the suffering throughout cyclic cycles of life, suffering of not only oneself but also of our family and of all other sentient beings. And from there arises the mind of renunciation, which is the aspiration for liberation. Along with bodhicitta, the awakening mind, these two minds, the renunciative mind and the awakening mind, are the very qualities of a true Buddhist practitioner and of a bodhisattva who walks the path of generosity, discipline, patience, diligent meditation, and wisdom, and embodies the qualities of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Bodhisattvas are beings who renounce the peace of an individual salvation and vow to work for the deliverance of all beings and to attain the supreme enlightenment of Buddhahood for their sake. So, renunciation, this aspiration, starts with self compassion, wishing ourselves to be free from suffering and its causes, and knowing all sentient beings experience the same conditions of samsara and wanting them to be free is a grander compassion from which the seed of bodhicitta is formed. When we just embarked on our Dharma practice, bodhicitta inspires us to practice diligently and patiently. In the middle, it motivates us to purify ourselves and eliminate all defilements. And at the end, it enables us to combine all the results from the practices of the six paramitas and the four immeasurables to do limitless work to benefit sentient beings and lead them to liberation and unsurpassable enlightenment. Buddhists believe that everything is created by the mind, so without one's pure renunciative mind and bodhicitta, all the mantra chanting, different practices and rituals actually do little for oneself. The reason lies in what to be renounced and why. Beginning with the Four Noble Truths, Buddhism is a teaching of renunciation. It concerns what to be renounced and why. The Four Noble Truths are truths about suffering, without which there is no renunciation. Reflecting on suffering has a tremendous significance because only through recognizing and acknowledging the nature of suffering, not just the phenomena of suffering, one can possibly generate a genuine sense of renunciation, a pure aspiration to seek liberation from this bondage. And we can explore the objects of renunciation through some writings from Shantideva, the 8th century Indian Buddhist monk and scholar who was born a prince, yet on the night before his coronation had a dream in which Manjushri Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, appeared to him and told him to renounce worldly life and seek ultimate truth. In his most famous writing in the form of verse, The Way of the Bodhisattva, in chapter 8 on meditative concentration, Shantideva writes, because of loved ones and desire for gain, we fail to turn away from worldly things. These, then, are the first thing to renounce. The prudent should conduct themselves like this. This verse addresses a common phenomenon that has been consistent since historical times, that is, placing more importance on a person's external value, titles, certificates, learned skills, etc., over a person's inner wealth, generosity, sincerity, integrity, prudence, compassion, and seeking happiness and validation in outer things, be it a partner, a child, as indicated by the loved ones in the first line of this verse, or physical possessions, substances one consumes. Those are the desire for gain, unrealistic hopes for joy and happiness in these things, the worldly things for which we generate unrealistic wishful thinking. And Shantideva is saying that these are the first thing to renounce. And what to renounce isn't the loved ones or things in our possession or things we enjoy doing, but the unrealistic hope we place in these things. There's a Korean TV show that I finished recently. It is called Sky Castle. It is about four upper middle class family living in a gated community with the father either being a surgical doctor or a university professor, and the mothers being responsible for the children's education. They all have one goal in mind: to have their kids get into medical school and become a doctor, which is considered a highly respected job in contemporary Korea. There's only one mother among the four families who is not on the same page with her husband, who is a professor, who cannot let anybody else tutor their own sons because he is obsessed that his sons study their way to the top, and he employs highly stressful and unhealthy study methods to push them. One day the wife finally confronts her husband out of her strong desire to protect her children from the tyranny of their father. She understands that her husband constantly has the need to show off his knowledge because all other fathers living in the same neighborhood are all sons of doctors, whereas her husband's father owned a laundry business, which he is ashamed of. So he needs show off constantly to compensate for his sense of inferiority, and he is using his sons as tools, hoping that their worldly success in the future can fix his inferiority complex. Although this is a drama TV show, it portrayed contemporary Asian society very realistically. This is an example for the first two lines of this verse by Shantideva. Because of loved ones and desire for gain, we fail to turn away from worldly things. Again, it isn't the loved one or gain per se that one needs to renounce. It is the unnecessary projections and unrealistic hopes that create delusions in the mind that one needs to let go of. If a person continues to be guided by their own delusions, their delusions become their reality. Then how could this person have the right view of oneself and of the world, which is the very first step in the Buddhist Eightfold Path, which is a teaching that guides us towards enlightenment? And Shantideva's writing continues: beings, brief, ephemeral, who strongly cling to what is also transient, will catch no glimpse of those they love. For many thousands of their future lives, not seeing them, their minds will have no joy. They therefore will not rest in equanimity. But even if they see them, they are not content. And as before, the pain of longing stays. The first line refers to beings with the worldly mind whose own existence is subjected to the law of impermanence. When such beings, who themselves are brief, ephemeral, strongly cling to people or things that are equally impermanent, they will surely experience dissatisfaction and suffering. It is the unrealistic projections and hopes that drive us to hold onto external and physical things because of the false belief that they can bring us lasting happiness. Impermanence is one critical truth of our existence of the worldly world. By fully understanding this truth, one has the right view. The fact is, no matter how frequently we manage to have short-term gratification, we cannot quench our thirst. The longing for something lasting, something permanent and complete. Thus, there is not much to gain by holding on to outer pleasure that can never bring lasting joy. And we don't need to personally experience misfortune or loss or regrets to understand impermanence. The teaching of impermanence is in a falling leaf, in the changes of seasons, in the rising of moon and setting of sun. A renunciate's practice is to experience each moment fully, cherish the moments of seeming permanence, but have the right view and see the reality of impermanence with equanimity. Otherwise, our mind is trapped, as described in the verse below, trapped by the unquenchable longings and increased unwillingness to let go of certain thoughts, particularly those that cause us suffering. And not only for things we've had or experienced, we can also renounce things we never had or had never experienced. If every time we need to personally experience certain changes of life before we are able to let go, the time is doubled for us to get closer to enlightenment. It also makes it harder for self cultivation because we may get entangled in experiences and delay our cultivation. And it is not just about renouncing unrealistic hopes for physical things or worldly activities. The Four Noble Truths is about suffering and its cessation. What to be renounced, then, is suffering and unsatisfactoriness, which are felt within. But what is suffering or unsatisfactoriness? The Buddha left the answers in the First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering. Birth is suffering because of the repetitive and unending nature of sentient beings' cyclic cycle of life. Old age and aging is suffering. Illness, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Death is suffering, and not to get what one wants is suffering. These five groups, the objects of clinging and attachment, are suffering. They together constitute the totality of a self or a being. A being can also be seen as the product of the five skandhas, the five aggregates: form or matter, feeling, perception, mental formations or activities, and consciousness. So it is from the self that is the source of suffering where suffering is generated. And it is the self that must be renounced if one would attain ultimate liberation. The self forms our ego, the very subtle yet deep rooted sense of I-ness, which involves the desire for the continued existence of self, whether it's out of love or out of hatred. The five aggregates make up the whole of our human existence and experience. These are avenues through which we generate clinging or attachment, attached to things that we desire and attached to the aversion for things we do not desire. The self generates greed because of its attachment, both for the self and for things which the self believes that can enhance and secure the existence of the self, such as pleasure, possessions, pride, extreme criticality, comfort, and so forth. The self also builds guards around the self by generating hatred or aversion from things which threaten the continued existence of the self by frustrating or inflicting pain. So, for mentally troubled beings, suicidal or depressed beings, deep down, maybe they do not wish to terminate the whole of their existence. Yet it is the anti-self that the self created itself that keeps evolving. The self sets a trap for itself, a trap of angst, anger, hatred, confusion. What one wishes to end are actually the self-hatred, self-denial, the heaviness of heart, and not the positive aspects of oneself. Yet it is not easy to let go of the clinging to those negative self-defining qualities once they are formed and are being strengthened over time. Such views of oneself are delusions, and the suffering gets strengthened when awareness is absent. So, again, it's with the right view attained through employing skillful means while experiencing all colors of life, diligently and patiently cultivating one's mind, And finally, obtaining insights and wisdom, one can have the right view. And here are these metaphors by Padmasambhava, the great Buddhist Vajra master. Food and wealth are like dewdrops. It is uncertain when they disappear. Enmity is delusion. Understand it to be mistaken. When we understand the reality of impermanence, we will understand the effort in clinging to things, feelings that are transient, is in vain. And there is no need for such clinging and attachment, whether it's to what we gain, what we possess, or what temporarily takes over our mind. A thought, a feeling that burdens are being set traps for the mind. The Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna put his teaching on the trap of one's mind in a simple form in the 8 worldly concerns: hope for gain and fear of loss. The more attachment and aversion we have to the pair, the more we suffer. Hope for praise and fear of blame. One makes us happy, the other unhappy. Either way, our happiness depends on external things. Hope for good reputation or fame, and fear of bad reputation or insignificance. The question is how much in one's life material energy is consumed thinking about these concerns. And the last pair, hope for pleasure or happiness, and fear of pain or suffering. This is a never-ending vicious circle. The self and the world are interdependent. Our emotional responses to the world strengthens our sense of self. And our sense of self causes the illusory appearance of a permanent and substantial world with subjective mental formations of desirability and undesirability. The Buddhist ideal is to feel neither attachment in the case of happiness and beauty, nor revulsion in the case of suffering and ugliness, but simply to observe things as they really are with equanimity and perfect freedom of mind. What to be renounced are these worldly concerns, which are attachment that consist of one's ordinary existence in suffering. What to be renounced is unsatisfactoriness. It requires an expanded awareness and expanded limitless self-compassion to embrace all forms of existence and emotions within oneself. Renunciation is a self-examination process, a training to see clearly how we attach, how we shut down, how we choose to disengage in the world, and then learn how to drop all of this, letting go of the control that doesn't help us. While experiencing unsatisfactoriness, one shouldn't hold on to the annoyance, angst, anxiety one may feel. Instead, have the awareness that this is our body telling us that we are in this uncomfortableness, we are in this dissatisfactory nature of existence. Therefore, one should be peaceful or even grateful for these pains and sufferings, for without recognizing them, there is no genuine desire to seek liberation. This is also compassion, as compassion is a state of being understanding. It encompasses clarity of mind, which is wisdom and inclusiveness. Besides, the renunciation of the 8 worldly concerns should be applied to our spiritual experiences as well. In our own practice, sometimes we gain different sensations or feelings, some blissful, some makes us agitated. If we cling to these experiences, we would, in the future practice, consciously or unconsciously either search for similar experiences or harbor a sense of resistance towards similar experiences. And these new intentions actually led us astray, and one would be practicing with a distracted mind, slowing down one's progress. Now we are aware of the problem of oneself, that is the source of suffering. So one should renounce, let go of whatever that binds us to ignorance and suffering, thoroughly perceiving how we inflict pain on oneself by grasping and greediness. When we do, by incorporating this into our lives as practice and life are not separate, renunciation will naturally flow and nurture the self. It is a positive and liberating act, not a punishment. If the heart feels contracted, if the mind is still tight or agitated, then the renunciation is incomplete. And in order to have renunciation practice not feel like self punishment, there is the understanding that self renunciation and self acceptance are the same thing. If by forsaking a limited, transient ease, one would see an abundance of ease, similarly, this is how self renunciation leads to self acceptance and self liberation. We don't need to leave society being a recluse, living off the land, or becoming a monk or nun, or practicing asceticism to cultivate the mind of a renunciate. True renunciation is a matter of the heart and mind rather than the body. It is renunciation of the world of desires and aversion within, rather than of the world of objects on the outside. By changing to a different simplistic lifestyle, one only creates an outer appearance of simplicity. By carrying out the actions of letting go, one is simply justifying to deny themselves without truly changing any inner concept. This is to step off a certain lifestyle after being habituated in a certain lifestyle. When the heart of the renunciate is absent, one easily falls back into old habits and follows their habitual pattern without a counterforce. It is apparent that it is much easier to renounce material objects than to renounce one's false ego and unhealthy qualities, because external renunciation without a corresponding inner release makes strength and clinging. It is no surprise that people notice the strength of their desire after a period of deprivation. Not only is renunciation practice positive and liberating, it is also active. We constantly strive to achieve the state of non desire, of greater peace and happiness. It is active because we do not want to be numbly content, to get by, to be content with whatever. That kind of contentment is out of frustration, sadness, and helplessness. That is self punishment by lying to oneself that one might as well be fine because one just assumed the situation is only as good as it's gonna become. And then blocking, burying all the uncomfortable emotions. That is self dishonesty and self betrayal. That is an unwise surrender rather than a wise surrender to the unavoidable. Renunciation is not just a kind of complacency or using indifference and living passively. The effect of proper renunciation is a profound happiness, a marvelous sense of ease, a sense of lightness of being, a sense of well being, a gladness of heart. It is engagement rather than disengagement. For lay practitioners, we don't have precepts, which function as monastic renunciation to facilitate an inner transformation. There are ways for temporary monastic renunciation, such as meditation retreats, where you give up certain food, speech, freedom to do certain activities. However, for a being who is truly determined with their inner renunciation. The way to cultivate is to be aware of all the limitations one feels, whether difficult or subtle. Limitations can be in the form of a sense of reluctant feelings or overly subjective emotions or thoughts. Yet, every time that we become aware of such thing within ourselves, these limitations that create resistance in the mind actually become an opportunity for spiritual practice, to actively let go of the clinging, transcend out of the mental traps. The time and effort vary in different beings, yet when the being sees renunciation not as limitation but as unburdening, this is where that being can take a kind of grounded happiness in feeling free from desire and compulsion. Having complete renunciation is like having fertile soil on which all kinds of flower and plants can be grown, because the mind is free without limitation. A practitioner with stable or consistent renunciation has very little greed and attachment to the ordinary attractions of the world and to the cyclic existence in samsara, and has little inflicted emotions in the mind. A practitioner with strong renunciation would benefit starting from this life and future lives. Because of such a being's confidence in the path of renunciation, they would practice diligently without slacking. That is, having the awareness of one's mind of renunciation through each passing moment of life. Someone with genuine renunciation would also be a highly compassionate being, because without the understanding of the truth of suffering, there is no pure compassion nor genuine renunciation. And with little defilements in one's mind, a practitioner with genuine renunciation would achieve spiritual accomplishments swiftly, without the possible blockages created by one's mental defilements. Also, as indicated by the title of today's talk, happiness, joy, and the lightness of being. If the troubles or suffering of a being multiplies easily, that being's existence would be heavy. So beings with genuine renunciation feel light and tranquil. In our own practice, part of the full awareness that we always talk about is to examine ourselves, to constantly examine our mind. If a practitioner lacks true diligence and patience in their practice, or only treats the Buddhist path as a hobby, practicing without discipline or consistency, or practicing for worldly rewards, these are the signs that a genuine renunciation is not there in his or her mind. These are the signs that there is still confusions, doubts, attachment for the world that are the blockages for the person's spiritual cultivation. Finally, the compatibility of the four immeasurables and renunciation. It should be remembered that compassion, loving kindness, joy, and equanimity for the world and self, and renunciation of the world and self are not incompatible. On the contrary, they are inseparable. For these qualities are the purest only when the mind is totally disinterested. In the past, we've talked about the four immeasurables and the qualities and actions around them that leads to a boundless heart. Yet when we try to embody these immeasurable qualities, most of the time our intentions are not as pure as we would wish them to be, and it's usually without awareness. And the challenge is that before we are enlightened, we can never be sure if the world we see is exactly what it is, without any subjective filters. And we don't even see ourselves clearly. For example, when I help others, I wonder if there's any ulterior motive, if there are any expectations for reward, if there's the awareness of my compassion. But why should I even have this awareness of my compassion if my mind is completely pure and disinterested? If the awareness of such things is present in me at all, my compassion is tainted by self-interest. Or if I help a person because I care about the person, my motives are still touched with selfishness, for caring is subjective. It is not equal. Would I still help a person in need if the care is absent? And how would I even decide who to help while my care for each person is different? When care is present, there is always favoritism. Even though I genuinely aspire to be just, I fail to be just. So, since a sense of self is an indication that ignorance has not been completely eliminated, it shows that a person who wishes to help has not yet attained ultimate wisdom and clarity of mind and a clear view of the world. This person's help will be less effective than the help of someone who is completely disinterested. The ultimate form of compassion has an immediacy. There is no middle steps for care nor repulsiveness, which are both generated by itself. The ultimate form of compassion is an immediate response that doesn't require emotional projections. Therefore, we have the seemingly paradoxical conclusion that a perfect compassion can arise, and the perfect help can be given only where there is perfect detachment from those who have completely renounced the world and renounced their sense of self. Like the historical Buddha and Bodhisattvas, who can easily remain in the peace and joy of their individual salvation, choose to engage in the worldly world in order to help liberate beings in suffering with and without awareness. It cannot be argued that their love for the world, their compassion are in the purest form. So thank you for being here this afternoon. I hope I've provided some clarity of this very unique concept, even though it is more important for us to understand what renunciation is through our own cultivation. May we all experience the cessation of I and you, self and others, mine and yours, the cessation of such unnecessary dichotomies through renunciation. May the ground of all confusion be dissolved. Greed, hatred, and ignorance can come to an end in this very life. The four immeasurable qualities on the path of the six paramitas become unshakable, and we know a mind that is awakened. 有缘